Louisville. I'm Tony Kemper, head of the DePaul School, and to lead us in our invocation is John Clark. John is president of Old Stone Press and a Paul Harris Fellow. Geriatric and Palliative Services. He is a Paul Harris Fellow and a former director of our club. Babar.
Dear fellow Rotarians, my sacred script, Quran, sacred scripture of over 1.6 billion human beings across the globe, was first translated into Latin in 1143 by Robert Keaton, and then later on in French in 1647, Italian in 1547, and in English by George Sale in 1734. And our founding father, Thomas Jefferson, owned that copy, which to this day is preserved in Library of Congress. These earlier translations, unfortunately, were not a true academic work. After the Crusades, the European religious establishment thought that they cannot overcome the infidels by going to Middle East. Let's prove the religious superiority. So this work was done to prove the superiority of Bible over Quran. It was not done in an academic sense. But our guest tonight, he belongs to a rare breed of human beings who has not only served our nation with valor and dignity in battlefield, using his talent as an author to bring people together, to bring God and humanity together. Islam and Christianity are the two major religions of this world, and they have lived in peace and harmony over a millennium, except the era of crusades. And in this time and age, when we hear about war between the civilization, when we hear all the myths, there is more need than ever to bring more understanding, to bring this scripture to the common person so they can read by themselves rather than having middlemen sitting at TV channels, mostly at Fox. Our speaker, he's a wonderful man. He's a person of faith. He's a God-fearing man who did this academic work not in intention to prove superiority or inferiority, just to put it out in plain English so that a common person can understand. And quite frankly, very rarely, once in lifetime, we get chance to encounter such a saintly soul. And tonight, this is my honor and humility that I present to you Major Jason Howk. Please give him a Louisvillian welcome.
Can everybody hear me okay? All right, clicker works. I'm going to get through these slides pretty quickly because I want to give you a chance for Q&A, although they always say to end on a high note, so after an introduction like that, I should just step off the stage right now. Thank you so much, and I appreciate all the help and support you give me. I really do. I start with this slide when I talk to people, and this slideshow is created, this discussion I lead is for people who don't know anything about Islam. So if you know something about Islam, you may get a little bored. But hang in there, there's Q&A at the end, and you'll find that it's pretty fascinating. As I've been doing this for 3 years, I always come across people who say, you know, Islam is a very violent religion, and you hear the counterpoint, no, Islam is a religion of peace. And I talked with a good friend of mine who helped me when I was in grad school. He was my thesis advisor, and he sent this note to me in an email one day. He said, Jason, just explain it like this. It's just a religion. Islam is a religion like every other religion. War and peace, that's what men decide to do. You can do anything you want. I could take the book Moby Dick and make a violent cult out of it and take you to war with Moby Dick as our sacred text. You can do that. Books are useful for that. So just start at this point. It'll make things easier. I try to help people understand to put these concepts into 3 buckets in your brain. Islam, a religion up there with the green, a religion like many other religions. Islamism, in red, like capitalism, socialism, fascism, communism. It's an ism. It's a political ideology. It's actually not a very popular one across most of the Muslim countries. There are a few that have it, but usually they don't win a lot of votes in their seats. And then you get to groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Arabian Peninsula, whatever you want to call all these groups that are out there today that most of our soldiers are engaged with around the world. They are a violent group. They're radical Islamists. They don't want to just get to Islamism as a political ideology through ballot boxes. They'll kill you to get there. That's what their mindset is. And most Muslims would tell you they're not Muslims at all. They've fallen off the face of religion long ago with those kind of beliefs. So Islamism, this political ideology where you put the power of religion and political leader into one person, and violent radical Islamist groups, they are seeking to force people into that. And the first victims are usually other Muslims. That's the way they operate. I'll just summarize this slide for you. If you talk about religion in America, you will never make the extremists at any bent happy. You will be called every name there is. It's just something you got to get used to. So be aware of that if you'd like to go into this topic. Pop quiz. All right, what percentage of these people are terrorists and what percentage are American heroes? This is interactive. I need some feedback here. What percentage? 10% heroes? 100% terrorists? What do we got? I hear all heroes. Both? All right, the correct answer is there's no way to tell. Their first names. They could say Tom, Dick, and Harry up there. It's just a first name. It may sound Muslim, may sound Arabic, may sound Persian. It's just a name. That's it. You can't judge a book by its cover. Start with that. In reality, I know who these people are. I wrote them down. 5 of them are American patriots. 5 of them are some of the worst terrorists in the world that we've hunted down. Only I know that. If you look at a first name, it shouldn't tell you anything. One of those guys is actually a naval aviator who earned a medal for valor on the ground in Afghanistan, serving our country. So some of these are some really important people to me. All right. Just some quick numbers here. This is how the population of the world stands right now with major religious groups. So about 1.6, 1.7 billion Muslim, 2.2 billion Christian. The most fascinating fact to me on there when I was looking up these numbers is in red. Look at the growth of non-religious people around the world right now. That's one of your largest growth areas. How much do you think this is going to change in the next 4 decades? Quite a bit. Islam is still the fastest growing religion in the world. So in about 4 decades, that chart's going to flip. There will be more Muslims than there are Christians. This is not about conversion. This is about birth rates. Most of you probably have stuck with the religion you were born into, right? Most people don't change their faith. So this is going to change just strictly on birth rates. So in many of your lifetimes, Christianity will no longer be the largest religion in the world. What is this map telling us? Red is bad. Any ideas? Some of you might be able to read it. Those are terrorist incidents over the last 45 years. Are there a lot of Muslims in Colombia? No. It's got a red spot, right? Again, a lot of people like to tie terrorism to a religion. I just want to remind people, terrorism happens all around the globe. It can be tied to any topic, subject, idea. When you hear this term, the Muslim world, which is not a real place, but people like to throw this word around, that's what they're generally talking about. North and now sub-Saharan Africa, pushing farther south, up into the old stands of the Soviet Union, down across India and out into the Pacific Ocean. And where's the largest Muslim population in the world? What country? Indonesia. What's that dark green spot in the middle? That's the Shia faith. 2 big sects in Islam, Sunni and Shia. That's where the majority of Shia live. There's Shia in every country in the world, but that's where the majority of Shia live. This is where growth is going to happen in the Muslim world, as some people like to call it, over the next few years. So those countries in yellow have about 10% right now, a Muslim population. They're going to grow. That's where you're going to see that growth that we talked about earlier. If you've never read ISIS strategy, I want you to think about it for a second. This is how ISIS thinks. I mentioned there are people who will just kill other people to get their way politically. This is their mindset. If you've never read it before, you should really think about their view of the world. That's unfortunately how they think. You really can't reason with people like this. That is the sad part. And the real solution to groups like ISIS is to stop the recruiting. You don't stop the recruiting by shooting people, right? You stop the recruiting by talking to people. Just like if anybody's done any work with anti-gang task forces in America, you've got to reach people when they're pretty young, because they'll start recruiting folks into ISIS in elementary school. So you've got to get started early, and you need to talk. They mentioned the word the caliphate there. I'm going to hit a few vocabulary words today. They'll probably help you when you're watching the news or reading the newspaper. That large green area on the map, that was the largest caliphate or religious empire that existed in history. So that's what ISIS is thinking about when they talk about rebuilding the caliphate. Spain to India, that's what's on their mind. That was the largest. It fell apart after this. That's about the year 750. Those stars, unfortunately, show you the places that ISIS was able to plant their flag. So you need to think about that. That's how far they've spread their idea and ideology, unfortunately. Much larger than the original caliphate that they're talking about. And that's something we're all dealing with. This is where things stood about 2016. Quick ISIS update. In that time period, they had 3 major areas in the Middle East, across Syria and Iraq. Today, they just have those 3 red zones. So on the ground, the militia, this army of ISIS, has just about been pushed out. But unfortunately, I showed you an earlier map, their idea hasn't been. So the idea is the part we still have to work on. Where do you think this picture is from? Those are young students being indoctrinated at an ISIS school. Any guesses? It's not Iraq, it's not Syria. Malaysia. 8-year-old kids being indoctrinated by people who think like ISIS. That's the part we have to get to. We have to get to education. We have to reach young people at a younger age and talk to them about the differences. You can't shoot an ideology. You can't bomb it, you can't drone it, you can't put a bullet into it. You have to talk about it. That's what I'm out here doing and talking about. Things like this Khawarij or Islamist ideology, this violent way of thinking. All right, let me talk to you a little bit about Islam and the Quran. That's it with the ISIS update. We'll come back to where things stand on that. These are some key terms that are helpful if you're trying to understand the history of Muslim society and Muslim culture and Islam. We talked about the religion already. There's 2 major sects, Sunni and Shia. The really simple way I try to explain that to people, the Sunni side, which is the largest sect, about 85%, 82%, they're a little bit more like the Protestant side of Christianity. All right, they have their local preacher, their local mosque. You go and you talk to them. There's no real hierarchy beyond that. You're going to have your births there, your weddings there, your funerals there. That's your local. If you have a question, you go to your local prayer leader. On the Shia side, it's a little more like the Catholic Church. All right, you have a hierarchy of people. You can ask questions. There's actually a great website about Grand Ayatollah Sistani's website. You can read what this Grand Ayatollah or Pope, for lack of a better word, has to say about Islamic ideas as you put them towards the modern world. There was a third group that split away at that same time period that most people don't know about or understand. They were called the Khawarij. In Arabic, these are the people who left or seceded from it. These were unfortunately the best fighters when this violent split happened inside the religion. And they decided at that point that they were the most pious Muslims in the world, and everybody else was beneath them. And they wandered around the Middle East and set up checkpoints, and they would stop groups of people and they'd ask them, what type of Muslim are you? And they would judge whether they were Muslim enough for them. If this is sounding familiar to groups like ISIS, there's a reason for that. They took that ideology, they wandered around the Middle East. Most of the Muslims that were being terrorized by this group hunted them down and killed them. But there were some that escaped to Africa and a country called Oman, which today is one of the most tolerant Islamic countries in the world. So time changes things. The Quran, the holy book. The hadiths are another set of things that the Prophet Muhammad said during his life that were gathered down in books, but not all Muslims agree which hadiths are the correct books. There are many of them. So the Quran is the exact word of God. Hadiths are other collections that are considered sacred by some people, but nobody really agrees on them. That's a simple way of thinking about it. And the Sunnah is talking about the way that Muhammad lived his life, because he's a role model. He's a prophet. He's the last prophet in this Abrahamic tradition, so it's following his way of life. Sharia law. No one's heard of that one? Okay, so have you heard of the 10 Commandments? Yes, I see some heads moving up and down. All right, if you take all the do's and don'ts, all the commandments out of the Quran and write them down on a piece of paper, you just wrote out Sharia law. Okay, in a nutshell, that's it. It's the do's and don'ts. How those are enforced in every country is completely different, and how they think about it, what they would say is Sharia law, because Islam is not that old of a religion. So most countries had a culture and a legal system and a moral code and cultures and values long before their religion came there. So if in some back village in the small spot of Afghanistan believes you should push a wall on top of a woman for committing adultery, they think it's Sharia law. It is not in the Quran, but that's what they would equate to it. So there are many different ideas about that. But in its simplest text, it should be the do's and don'ts, just like most of our laws are based on the 10 Commandments in America. All right, jihad. Again, another word no one's ever heard of. My general advice on the word jihad, if you don't know exactly what it means, never use it. You're never going to use it correctly. You're probably going to sound silly. But what it actually means in Arabic is to struggle. It's a verb, to struggle or to strive. It's used about 12, 13 times in the Quran. It's not on every page, as some people would lead you to believe. It does not mean war, it does not mean combat, does not mean attack, does not mean kill. There are other Arabic words for that. It's quite a large vocabulary in the language. So it's used to define somebody who struggles and strives with all their wealth and person to better themselves and better their religion. If you were a woman and you went to India and you were Catholic and you gave your whole life to taking care of orphans, what are they going to call you? You know what I'm talking about, Mother Teresa? You're going to be a saint, right? So somebody who truly struggles their whole life and is Muslim and gives their heart and soul and all their wealth to make the world better, to make themselves better, to make their religion better, it's like calling them a saint in a simple way to equate it. So if you're going to use it to describe a terrorist, thank you for complimenting a terrorist. That is not going to help us in the long run. Just don't use the word if you don't know what it means. Islamism, Islamist ideology, I spoke about that. It's this idea of putting all the power of religion and politics, governance into one person and having that complete religious law and code that you follow. Again, not very popular in most countries. If a Catholic became president tomorrow and said we're all going to start going to Mass on Sunday, that would even make the Catholics mad in this country, because some just go on Easter and Christmas. So most people don't like to have all that religion shoved on top of them in their governance. Same idea and concept around the world. Some poor girl was arrested today in Iran, and they're trying to sentence her for 2 years in jail for taking a scarf off her head. People don't like to live under those kind of rules. Salafism is another word you hear. This is about the concept of going back in time to the good old days and living like the Prophet Muhammad and his friends did in the 600s in Arabia. Again, probably not a popular concept with a lot of people, but there is a group of people that want that. Wahhabism is a sect in Saudi Arabia that kind of pushes that idea. They're running up against the new crown prince in Saudi Arabia who's trying to change all that today, so there's a lot of this stuff in flux. And then you get to that violent radical Islamist ideology or Khawarij ideology, followed by groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. These are people who will just kill you to get what they want. They think they're the most pious Muslims in the world, and most Muslims would say, you left this religion a long time ago. What's in the Quran? About 114 chapters. I like to say you can equate that to a sermon. They get longer as the prophet is speaking over this 23 years, just like most preachers. They get to speak a little bit longer every time. They gain experience. But it's an oral tradition. It's spoken. He wasn't reading or writing it. Over 6,000 verses. Took 23 years for him to explain this. And this built his religion. It was gathered after he died. Took about 20 years to put it together into an official Quran, which was sent out around the world. And in Arabic, that official Quran is the only one that is always translated over and over and over again. Once you take it out of Arabic, it's no longer the Word of God exactly, because it's not in Arabic. And the Arabic can be found in probably just about every language in the world today. And I think I'm probably the 65th person to do it in English. So that's what happens when you take it out. Why did I interpret it? One, if you pick up the typical Quran, it's not going to be chronological. So you're not going to be able to read it in a 23-year story. Pretty difficult to do. So I wanted to put it in 0 to 23 there for years. Also, most current English interpretations are hard to read. So I wanted to take out the King James Bible sounding Shakespearean words. And some copies contain some very unhelpful additions that the editors and translators put into the book, which don't help us. If you ship out something that has a lot of violent passages added to it in the footnotes or in an appendix around the world in other languages, you're not sending out the Quran anymore. You're sending out a different book. What's in the Quran? You probably heard of these ideas in a religious book. creation, do's and don'ts, how to live, the end of times, the hereafter. Who stars in this book? You've probably heard of none of these people in your life. These complete list of strangers to you. Who shows up in the Quran many times. I know more about Moses now than I do from ever going to Sunday school as a Baptist. Moses is in the Quran a lot of times. You'll get that story if you read it. Messages. These are some of the key messages that come out of the Quran. If you take the key words that are over and over and over again. Forgiveness, one of the most popular concepts in the Quran. Oneness of God, faithful community, the codes of conduct, punishment for hell. You've heard of religious books like this? Okay. If you put it into a chart, those are the words that pop out at you. These are the major words that are over and over and over again in the Quran. There might be some surprises up there for you if you've never read the book. But that's what jumps out at you. There are controversial verses, and these are what groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda will cling to. They will ignore 99% of the book and pull these 3 verses out and use them over and over again to brainwash people that don't know much about religion to start with. That you should strike an unbeliever on the neck when you meet him on the battlefield. They'll leave out the battlefield part. That God takes care of those who die in his way and he'll send them to paradise. You've heard the myths about that. And that you can question another man's faith. And that's the one they like to use a lot. And that's unfortunate. There are also verses that are helpful to women. And most people don't think of Muslim society being a great place for women to grow up. When you see all the pictures in Saudi Arabia and what the Taliban did to women in Afghanistan. But these are some pretty radical concepts in the 600s when the Vikings were pillaging all over the world. Dowry, inheritance, women getting inheritance rights in the Quran. That you can't be forced into marriage. That men should protect women. That women should be honored. Those are radical concepts in the 600s. Flip open a history book and refresh yourself on what life was like for women back then. Some people ask me my favorite verses. I think these are the ones that jumped out at me as I translated the Quran. Choose to forgive. God rewards those who forgive and reconcile. And the most courageous way to act is to be patient and forgiving. Again, these aren't the ones that ISIS or Al-Qaeda will pull out to teach their kids, but these are the ones that will jump out to you if you read it with a thoughtful mind. What gets added to it? This is the tough part. There's a lot of things that get added to the Quran, and that's what we're trying to work on through education, to explain to people what's actually in it and what often gets added to it. And that's the tough part. People are starting to use better language to talk about these concepts that I explained to you today. The King of Jordan is talking a lot about this idea of this Khawarij ideology, these people who have left Islam and are doing these things in Islam's name, and he wants to challenge that. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is challenging that. In Egypt, they're challenging these ideas. We're starting to use better terminology, especially far from where we were in the presidential campaigns. And if you go back and read the speech that President Trump gave in Riyadh, you will see a huge change from what was said on the campaign trail by either side and the message that we're trying to get people to push around the world today. And this is from the new national security strategy of this government. We're dealing with violent radical Islamists, and we are trying to get rid of a wicked ideology. This is the 3rd president in a row who said America is not at war with Islam. And this is the first president since September 11th to say we have a problem with this ideology, and we need to talk about it and solve it. So that's what's going on. I'll take your questions at this point.
For those that do have questions, please approach the microphone. Just as I'm sitting there listening to all of this incredibly valuable information, I wish that I could have heard your presentation years earlier. It's incredibly invaluable, and as an educator, I must say, those are some of the best prepared PowerPoint slides I've ever seen. Those are fantastic, so thank you.
Thank you. These are based on 3 years of questions, so I try to answer your questions ahead of time. I hope I didn't kill all the questions. But
Here comes Casey. Thank you all.
Yeah,
Please introduce
thank you,
yourself.
Jason. Very interesting. My name's Casey Mayer. And can you just tell a little bit about your journey and how you ended up going down this path, and is it tied to your military service?
22 years ago, I was deployed to the United Arab Emirates to work with their special forces, and we lived together in the desert for a couple of weeks and ate together, trained together, played sports together, and I was exposed to this new culture and religion, and I started studying it from that point forward. And the Army was kind enough to turn me into a Middle East and South Asia regional specialist and sent me to grad school to get a master's degree in this, taught me Farsi and Arabic, and let me wander around and work on problems in the Middle East and work really closely with the Afghan government over the years. So it just was kind of a natural fit to keep explaining these concepts and things that I've learned in my travels.
That really was an excellent presentation. Thank you. There's a lot of confusion among the political climate in predominantly Muslim nations and the religion, the Muslim religion. For example, in the U.S., we have the tradition of our Bill of Rights with a First Amendment rights to religion, expression, assembly, and that tradition seems to have carried throughout much of the Western world, but does not seem to have carried throughout most of the Muslim world. Can you explain why that hasn't happened? Is there something about the Muslim faith that inhibits that, or is there some other reason for that?
I definitely say there's multiple reasons. We won't get to the core of that today, but some Muslim countries, religious tolerance is very important to them, and you won't see some of the problems that we have in others. But some countries, usually political decisions more than religious decisions, they are very strict about what other religions can be brought there, if missionaries can come in, if other texts can be brought in, when people change different religions. So it's country by country. I think for the most part it's usually done for political reasons at some point in that country's history. But then there are very extreme religious people in every religion who really push to have divisions between religion instead of looking at similarities. You know, it's always about finding the differences. And I'm a big fan of saying, we'll all find out when we get to heaven or wherever you think you're going. Yes.
Thank you for coming. Robert English with Van Zandt Insurance. Wanted to know if you could highlight the differences between Shia and Sunni and when they broke apart and why they hate each other so much.
Okay, so Sunni and Shia. In a nutshell, it was an argument over who was going to lead this Muslim community at the time frame. Ali ended up leading the Shia side of that in this outcome, which became the smaller sect eventually. The Sunni side was led by a different sect, different side of the family. It was mostly over leadership. Today, most of the differences you see between Sunni and Shia are more political in nature than they are religious. They use the same Quran. You know, they're going to read the exact same passages in Arabic. How they may interpret it, what they think of it, a little bit different, but again, still not different in major religious ways. But there are some fanatical sects in every religion who are going to push and say it's completely different, it's an abomination. Without going into too much detail, it started over leadership and command and control of this religious movement. Today it's a little more of a political argument that gets thrown back and forth, and they use it for political reasons, especially major countries that have one sect or the other or have strong feelings about it.
Hi, Jason. I'm Chris Whalen. Thank you for being here today. It's hard for me to imagine what the appeal is to join a terrorist group, you know, and how that's presented and how the recruitment is actually successful. So what is the appeal to somebody to join a terrorist group, and who's at risk, and how are they identified and found?
One of the jobs that I had in Afghanistan was to help their government create a peace program and make peace with some of the Taliban fighters. And so I got to sit down and listen to a lot of these Taliban fighters and find out what they were thinking, what was on their mind. And it was enlightening. There are many reasons why people can be convinced to join a terrorist organization. If you boil all those reasons down, though, it's usually somebody looking for a sense of belonging. So just like in America, I worked on anti-gang stuff in California. It's the kids who are very young that don't know where they want to go yet. Sometimes it's older people looking for adventure. I mean, there are literally 15, 20 different reasons people join it. But in the end, it's somebody looking for a place to fit in. So wherever there are children, young adults looking for a place to fit in, you have a ripe audience to be recruited into a gang, a terrorist organization, some kind of armed militia group. It's always the same story around the world, unfortunately. And that's that population that we often ignore in America and around the world. But those people are left at the margins, and they're looking for a place to be, to fit in eventually.
Muhammad Babar. Jason, can you just explain the concept of caliphate? That was the caliphate, you saw the Umayyads, was that a true caliphate or was it an empire in the disguise of religion? And what was the difference between the first 4 caliphs and when these caliphs come? And then when Imam Hussein in Karbala, when it comes, was it the role of leadership, but was that an effort to not to turn this concept of caliphate into an empire which Yazid and that family was trying to bring on? By the way, I'm a Sunni Muslim.
So there's this concept, before there was a split between Sunni and Shia, that the first original caliphates that followed the Prophet Muhammad leading this religious empire as it was back then, really just a religious movement, but it had political overtones because it had to do governance as well. They're considered the rightly guided, or those who did things correctly, and then there was a split. And there's arguments over how you would classify some of these early leaders. But these caliphates, after the split between Sunni and Shia, it was a division inside this religious movement, in this religious community. So over the years, many people claim to be a caliphate. Usually it's political reasons. They would set this up. As you go through time and you get all the way up to organizations like the Ottoman Empire, which is where we usually pick up history in America, that was the end of a caliphate. That 1924 was the last caliphate, and it was really closed down. But it wasn't so much some type of religious empire. There was already a split between the mosque and the state. The caliph was more of an advisor to the leader of the Ottoman Empire. He was more of a political leader. So this concept went away pretty early in time as a religious movement, and after that has been some type of political movement. And there were multiple caliphates that were split up over time. The last one, of course, we know is the Ottoman Empire.
And our 2 final questions, I believe.
Riggs Lewis, thank you for your service. Could you touch on the boundary lines of the modern Middle East and its connection to the World War I and World War II, and how that plays today?
Sure. If you want to know where a lot of the problems in the Middle East come from, study World War II. The end of it, the compromises, the treaties, the promises that were made to different leaders throughout that, because that was the end of the Ottoman Empire. And when it fell apart, and we all decided to draw different boundary lines, mostly drawn in Europe to be applied to somebody who lived somewhere else, the considerations of the people who lived in those countries, what would soon be nations, were not really taken into account. Many things happened. World War II, again, there were other divisions of other countries and areas. The idea of mandates ended after World War II, and most of those countries gained independence through the 50s and 60s around the world. So there are huge ramifications of the world wars that were mostly fought by European and American armies, and what happened in the Middle East. And it's about borders, it's about cultures, it's about ethnic groups, it's about the divisions that were created on the ground. Study those boundaries and how they were created, and the promises kept and unkept, and you'll find out where most of the problems have come from in this world, in that part of the world.
Jason, thank you for your enlightening discussion. I'm Ken Grossman. My question is, it seems like since 9/11 or even before, the U.S. has been mired in political or military battles in the Middle East, and it seems like it's never ending. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the U.S. role there. Has it been positive? What's the future? Is this going to go on for eternity?
I do think the U.S. interaction, and it won't always be military, in many of the countries in the Middle East is going to be a continuing effort. And it should be one of friendship and cooperation, because we have a lot of great friends in that part of the world. There have been a lot of wars and violence all through, since 1979, all throughout the Middle East and South Asia, and it's impacted a lot of people. After all those wars, there was never a Marshall Plan or anything like it to rebuild the societies and give them some kind of start to have a normal life again. So it has been constant rebuilding and destruction. I think for the most part, our impact has been positive. There are moments where we've done things that weren't so positive. Our intentions are usually good. There are some people in the government who may not always have good intentions, but I know from being on the ground and the people who are there that intentions have been good. And I'll give you one example of something that struck me the other day. If you haven't seen the television show Chain of Command on National Geographic, I highly recommend watching that, all 8 episodes. There's a moment in there in 2016, 2017, there's an Iraqi commander, and he's fighting against ISIS. And I've described to you the way ISIS thinks of the world and humanity. And this Iraqi fighter was standing there, and the cameraman were with him, and there were no more American soldiers around. He was out there on his own with his unit, trying to take care of some people. And a family came in and needed to be evacuated from his area because they were on the battle line with ISIS, exchanging rifle fire. That's a dangerous place to be. And this commander saw this family, and he knew he couldn't get them out by just telling them to run the other way, because as soon as they would leave his little safe area, they would get shot at. And he looked at the camera, and he looked at his men, and he looked at his armored personnel carrier, and he said, I have a duty as an officer in the Iraqi army to stay here and leave those people to fend for themselves to get out of here. But I have a duty as a human being to put those people in this armored personnel carrier and drive them out and put the fight on pause to make sure they're surviving. That Iraqi army is not very old. It was just started in 2003. But that's what they've learned, and that's something that I have heard throughout my career as a soldier from our soldiers. And that concept that I have to do what I have to do for the Army, but sometimes I'm going to break the rules because I'm a human too. And I've got to do the thing that's best for humanity. And that little nugget, that woke up so many people that spent years and years training the Iraqi Army, that some great lessons really did get through. The most important lesson, you're a human first when you're a soldier. So I think there are some stupid things that we have done, but for the most part, the impact has been positive, and it should continue to be an ongoing effort, more of cooperation and hopefully on economic grounds instead of just military grounds.
Retired U.S. Major Jason Howk, wonderful presentation. Great job again, Speakers Committee. Just fabulous presentations, one after the other. Remember, we meet back here at the Fraser next week. Good to see everybody. Our meeting is adjourned.